Okay, this is chapter 6, energy and decay. So in this one, we're going to have a look at food chains and the carbon cycle. So the most important thing you need to remember is that all of the energy for the food chain comes from the sun. So radiation from the sun is a source of energy for most living organisms, and obviously that energy comes in the form of light energy. Okay, that then is taken in by the plant. A green plant contains chlorophyll, okay, in a process called photosynthesis, and that produces chemical energy which is then stored in the cells of the plant. Okay, and that forms what's called biomass. That's how the plants start to grow. So if we look at a food chain, standard food chain here, one that is probably pretty familiar to you, we start off with the producer, the green plant. Obviously prior to that, the sun would have come in and provided the energy to the oak tree to grow. That is then eaten by a caterpillar. Caterpillar is eaten by a blue tit eaten by a sparrowhawk. So the arrows are showing the transfer of energy through the food chain. It's not showing who eats who. So the oak tree is not eating the caterpillar, but it's the energy moving from the oak tree to the caterpillar. And often what you're asked to do is draw that and represent it using a pyramid of biomass. Okay, so that looks like this. And this is just showing a pyramid structure of biomass. So bio living, so living mass. And you can see here that the oak tree has the biggest biomass, then followed by the caterpillar, followed by the blue tit, followed by the sparrowhawk. So what we see at each stage is that we're actually losing energy through each stage of the food chain. Okay, so from the oak tree to the caterpillar, energy is lost and biomass is lost. The caterpillar to the blue tit and blue tit to the sparrowhawk. So it's constantly losing biomass at each stage. And it's worth you knowing a few reasons for that, because it often comes up in the exam as a question. So biomass is reduced at each stage because some materials and energy are always lost in waste materials, so in your feces. The animal moves and that requires energy. It needs to keep warm, and all parts aren't always eaten. So the hard parts of a plant or an animal, bones, etc., roots aren't always eaten, so the energy isn't always passed on. So you do tend to get this tapering at the top of a pyramid of biomass. They don't always look like this, but that's the common way you would most common version. Sometimes you'll see slightly less biomass at the bottom, followed by a slightly bigger block, but you'll need to have a look at that in the exam question. So that's just sort of food chains, and we're now going to go on to start thinking about cycles and how that works together. So when plants grow, they take the materials they need for growth out of the soil and they use that to grow, as well as the energy from the sun. And when that plant dies, the materials are returned back to the ground when they die and decay, and then that's just a constant cycle. They'll be used for growth, that will die, and etc, etc, it'll carry on. And the things that help death and decay, the decaying of the dead plants, are microorganisms. So microorganisms live in the ground, okay, and they help break down that dead material. So that's the process of decay. And decay works really well in warm, moist and aerobic conditions. Aerobic meaning with oxygen. Okay, so if there's no oxygen, you won't get much decay. So while your crisp packets are sealed in an environment without oxygen, so they don't decay, so your crisps stay fresh. Okay, so that's really important to remember those key features that are needed for decay. Often asked to list those down. The cycle they want you to look at is the carbon cycle, very important, and one that's commonly asked in a 6-mark question, so make sure you know the key words and processes. So let's have a look at that. So the thing I think to start off with, the most obvious thing, is that when we get the carbon dioxide in the air, so our atmospheric carbon dioxide, plants take that in during a process called photosynthesis, which we've talked about over here. And that's used by the plant to make fats, proteins and carbohydrates. So to start building its biomass, okay? We then get the first consumers, the primary consumers, which are then going to eat some of that green plant, that green material, and the carbon that's locked up in that plant becomes part of the animal now, being used to make fats and proteins. So that's gone into this animal here. But both of those, the green plant and the animal, will release some of that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere by a process called respiration. Okay, remember that plants don't just photosynthesize, they also respire, particularly the roots where there is no chlorophyll for photosynthesis. They will use respiration to generate energy. So both of those will release carbon dioxide back through respiration. Okay, and then when that animal dies, That animal will be broken down by the microorganisms we've talked about up here. If they've got warmth, moisture and aerobic conditions, that process will happen. And those microorganisms are living things. They will also breathe and respire, breathing out carbon dioxide. So respiration happens as a process happening inside the cell, produces carbon dioxide, and the animal exhales that then in breathing, okay, and puts that back into the atmosphere again. And obviously the nutrients here are going to be recycled back, just like over here, back into plants for growth. Okay, so that really, we could have had an arrow going back around there as well. And finally, the last little bit we want to put in here is that combustion. Combustion is going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So burning wood, fossil fuels will release carbon dioxide back into our atmosphere. Okay, so that is the carbon cycle. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 6. So we've looked at food chains, pyramid of biomass, how energy is lost in a food chain, okay, and then a cycle and the carbon cycle.